All right, well, we might go straight into it, but when we do Q&A, we will get people to introduce themselves briefly. And thank you. Welcome to the University of Bologna students. Great to have you here. So I'm going to open up with a few questions. Audience. First off, why did you become interested in international organizations? Why did you start studying them? And how do you study them compared to other people in the field?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And so how did I get interested in working on international organizations? I was a political theorist at first and really interested in social contract theory, and I will spare you all of that story. But the bottom line there was that in the end, I was also interested in how sovereignty is being practiced. And one location where sovereignty is being practiced or challenged, practiced and challenged, are international organizations, in particular when it comes to security policies. And so in a way, I moved from social contract theories to the interest of sovereignty to international organizations. And when I wrote my master's thesis, I did an internship with NATO at the time. And that was the time when the EU was just trying to create a European security and defense policy. It was called ESDP at the time, CFSP now. In any case, I was sitting in all of these meetings where you had like the German ambassador to the EU next to the German ambassador to NATO. Sorry, never good with mics. And so on. And I was just observing this. And so not only did I become interested in IOs, but right away I became interested also in how organizations actually negotiate or not among each other. So this is how it all started.
And did that influence your way of studying international organizations, including the UN? Because we're talking a bit about lunch, about different approaches and some being more functional approaches to the study of IOs. So how did that experience shape your study?
Completely. I mean, I saw how they were alive before I learned about them, theoretically speaking, right? So I saw how if you want to actually come up with a ministerial communique at the end, how actually the ministers sit in one room while everybody else was working in the other room, waiting for them to negotiate the hard points. And those who really cannot get to be discussed among the top diplomats, the ambassadors, would then be sent to the ministers, for example. And so just observing the diplomatic skill. So I was sitting in the room with the diplomats, not with the politicians. And so just observing the diplomatic skill and how that could matter to get certain just wordings, right? We would say like symbolic politics, cheap talk, who cares? I mean, in these organizations, words matter a lot and they mean a certain thing. So you fight over words quite a bit. And so that's not necessarily a rational or functional logic to it per se. I mean, everything is rational to a certain degree if you believe that also ideas, norms, ideologies can inform your preferences. And as long as you act consistently according to these kind of ideational aspects, could be called rational as well. But so I observed how like the diplomatic skill, but I also observed what politically speaking could go through and couldn't go through, right? So I mean, so the political dimension became very important there too. So in my dissertation, actually, I took that kind of impression with me and was working at something that to this day is maybe not super popular when you study international organizations. I looked into party ideologies and how they can actually inform the creation and the maintenance of international organizations. So how different political parties, which are often, I mean, often we talk about the national interest, right? Especially when we talk about security policy. There's the US interest, there's the German interest, there's, I don't know, the Brazilian interest in a certain international organization, as if this is like anachronistic. There's like no change over time. But if you look over time, what you can observe sometimes, sorry, I never know whether I look at you or you because you're asking the question.
Look
so
at them, look
super
at them.
impolite.
I'm not bothered.
So to understand a little bit better, like preference changes over time, at least in my research, what I discovered. And to this day, I'm trying to find my dissertation proposal because I'm pretty sure party politics did not figure in the proposal. But then when I did the actual research, I observed that parties could matter quite a bit. So just to say, like, then I was looking into how different political parties valued organizations. In this case of the dissertation, it was the EU and NATO, and how different parties actually position themselves differently towards the appreciation or non-appreciation of these organizations. And that had an impact as to whether Europe, the European Union, could actually create a security institution, and then also how they relate to one another.
And I think that's a nice segue into one of the themes of today's conversation, which is around contestations of the UN's role in conflict management, because contestation is very much a topic within the broader IR literature, whether it be like norm contestation or more specifically contestation of the liberal international order. And I wanted to ask you, in your work, people often say the UN represents this liberal world order, but in the piece that you've been working on, you sort of ask some questions about that. You mentioned its rules were legally ambiguous. So can you tell us a bit more about what did you see historically, early on in the UN's creation, its role in this liberal international order, specifically related, to peace and security?
Yeah, I find this entire debate, I don't know how familiar you are with it, the LEO, as they call it, the Liberal International Order, capitalized. Super fascinating, because it's as if we discovered now that it's apparently in demise. I mean, I don't know, in the 1990s, at least to my knowledge, nobody was talking about the LEO, right? I mean, there was John Eikenberry, who wrote about liberal notions that were like US hegemony, who spread liberal values, right? Who like locked in liberal preferences by creating NATO, etc. But it was not discussed as the liberal international order. And so now that we actually declaring it in demise, we also call it a certain thing, LEO. And to me, this never sat well with what I had observed while doing research on international organizations. I mean, clearly there is some liberalism ingrained in certain organizations. I'm not denying this. I don't want to say that all of them are completely illiberal, aliberal. Yes, but first of all, if you look at the different founding texts, there are other values ingrained in them as well. And if you look into the practice, especially when it comes to security policy, the way that certain organizations select to intervene or not intervene cannot necessarily be attributed to liberal notions. So that just at large. So now when we look at the UN, I was interested. So, I mean, was there a liberal moment at least, right? I mean, and if so, when can we locate them? Was the creation of the UN this liberal moment? Right, creation of the UN. We are at the end of World War II. And it seems as if we can only think and rethink global governance after a war, right? World War I, League of Nations, World War II, United Nations. And I'm not sure we can, I mean, maybe the 1970s with the new economic order, that might have been another way where we thought about ideas about the world. But other than that, not sure. Anyway, we are at the end of World War II. The UN is being created, and not all, I mean, first of all, this is still the time of colonialism, right? So we have big colonial powers on the negotiation table to actually think about how the UN should look like. And so from the get-go, what we can see is that actually this idea of the international maintenance of peace and security has some liberal notions attached to human rights. But if you look at the actual chapters, chapter 6, chapter 7, chapter 8, they don't sound that liberal at all, right? So in that sense, first of all, so-called peacekeeping was not in the UN Charter, right? So in the UN Charter itself, we don't see this kind of activity for the UN foreseen. So it's only at the end of the 40s, but really 56, that peacekeeping makes it onto the table. And so this could be created because of legal ambiguities within the UN Charter, right? So it needed people such as the Secretary General at the time, but also UN diplomats like Ralph Bunche, I heard that you spoke about him last week or a few weeks ago, who actually started crafting this activity for the UN called peacekeeping. And peacekeeping then was, so the first peacekeeping operation happened in Egypt after France and the UK had the so-called Suez crisis, right? So there's some imperial notions already as to how France and the UK can govern this part of the world. Just to say, so we have this ambiguity in the text that allows for peacekeeping to emerge. The ambiguity that exists too, which is not really in this example, is who has primacy in the maintenance of international peace and security, whether it's the UN or regional organizations, or whether they can actually share this responsibility. That's also something that's heavily contested and is not already in the founding charter to be determined right away. So at least the international law scholars I read heavily debate what exactly that is.
And following up on that, one of the themes of an article, which you can talk about later, is forthcoming, is this contestation between the UN as the international organization acting and providing security versus regional organizations. And you point to challenges that came from Latin American countries about the role of the UN versus the role of regional Latin American organizations. Can you tell us a bit more about that? What was the contestation there?
Yeah, so I mean, so right after World War II, actually, the victorious powers, who were, by the way, also the decision-making powers when it comes to security activities, right? The UN Security Council, the P5, France, UK, US, China, and Russia have voting rights, which is also not very liberal when we think about decision-making, just as a little side note. But so they still thought at the time that the UN will be the main police actor within the world, right, to maintain international peace and security. But South African states from the get-go insisted that actually regional organizations should have a large say in the maintenance of peace and security as well, because they actually were afraid of imperial notions, especially coming from the US, right? That the US will impose where interventions will happen or not. And so it was actually them and not the victorious powers of World War II or the main powerful actors at the time who were pushing for the so-called Chapter 8 in the UN Charter. And Chapter 8 is about regional arrangements and how they can contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security. So again, depending on how we define liberalism, this could be a liberal act, right? In the sense of pushing for voice for a diverse set of actors instead of imposing a political position by 5 countries within a world organization. I mean, the world was at the time 59 states, but okay.
And so that's a really interesting example of what we don't think about much is these contestations at the outset of the liberal international order, given we're so focused on current ones. I wonder if you could speak now to some of the current climate of what the big threats are. China, Russia are often conceptualized as the threats to international peace and security, the liberal international order. How would you position them, given you have this more ambiguous kind of relationship with what existed previously anyway?
Completely. No, thank you. It's like, so for me, so we have this contestation from the get-go, right? So we have actually Latin American states who are contesting the primacy of the UN from the beginning. There's more contestation going on during the Cold War. There might have been this liberal moment in the 1990s where after the demise of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Russia for a while was actually using actively this term international community, and they thought it was located within the UN. China was still rather non-assertive, just abstaining from many Security Council votes. So in that sense, like France, UK, the US pursued quite a bit of this agenda. But I mean, this ended latest, I would say, with the Kosovo War intervention, where Russia turned its back and said, well, you're not abiding by the rules, so why should we? And I think there we can observe that Russia with time, I mean, earlier than maybe some might think, and I really do believe that Kosovo was quite an experience for Putin at the time as well. He was in the government, not leading, but under Yeltsin, working for Yeltsin, that this was just an abandonment of the international community by the West. NATO intervenes in Kosovo without a UN Security Council mandate, and has been pursuing an alternative vision. This is which we can observe very forcefully now, that in the paper I call spheres of influences, because I'm not a very creative scholar, but right, in a way, thinking through the world as where I define my sphere, nobody else can intervene. And then we can talk about the rest and maybe find compromises here and there, right? But so it's a very different vision of something that should be, the international community should be, say, liberal, for example, it should be universalized. For them, it's not really about universalizing their vision. There's like one sphere of influence for them. That's their main realm of intervention. That's how they also talk about Ukraine. This is how they talked about Georgia before. So that is pretty consistent to me. And China is also very interesting. I mean, while it was not super interested in being very active in the maintenance of international peace and security for quite a while, what we observe now is that's actually the biggest contributor to peace operations, while I should put in brackets, there are not many peace operations, UN peace operations anymore. The big ones are being closed. No new ones have been decided since 2014. So the ones that existed, China actually gave personnel, was leading some of these operations, but mainly what they're pursuing or an approach that they're presenting to the world is what they call developmental peace. So for them, it's actually much more a civilian approach with infrastructure projects, say like the Belt and Road Initiative, which we can also talk about. This is not the most progressive and, well, not a very active approach anymore, because China has also some economic troubles. But just to say, like, there's another approach that is much more via infrastructure projects pursuing, hopefully, in their view, peaceful relations. So again, not very much this kind of liberal notion that is sending militarized troops to countries and trying to stay impartial.
I'm going to ask one final question before turning it over. So get your questions ready. How do you go about studying things like contestations and international organizations? You mentioned at the beginning that you had been interested in the, use of discourse that negotiators use, and you could see that. What do you do to identify these kinds of contestations and figure out what's going on?
So for the UN in particular, you actually have you're not behind the scenes, but you have great access to minutes in the Security Council. I mean, there's something called the Security Council report that you can also look at. So you already have a good idea as to what the negotiations are in the Security Council, as in understanding what the positions are, where the debates are, where the red lines are, right? So to me, it's often trying to identify where the red lines are, where no compromise should be able anymore. So you identify the red lines, and then you see whether actually some actor gives way to another one. So that would be the margin of maneuver that I would want to look at if I study contestations, which I try to do to a certain degree in that paper that you didn't read. Apologies, but it's not out yet.
On the paper, if you are interested in it, I got an advanced reading of it. I can advertise it now. It's forthcoming in Global Studies Quarterly in January 2024. So you're getting a foretaster of what is to come in the new year. And a minor note on the Security Council report, there's a little New Zealand connection, which I'll throw in, which is a leading New Zealand diplomat, Colin Keating, who was chairing some of the debates around Rwanda as a temporary member of the Security Council, not one of the permanent 5, found that there was a real asymmetry of information, and that they really struggled as the New Zealand and other smaller countries and with smaller diplomatic forces to stay abreast of what was happening. So they created this report, the Security Council report, and actually I think it was affiliated with Colombia for a while as an impartial source of information to provide the non-permanent members, because the permanent members have a whole apparatus, they have institutional memory, they have staff who've worked at the Security Council for years, so they have a whole lot. They're also bigger countries with more money to help the small countries. So it's interesting to see how that resource can be used. And I think it's something to keep in mind for those of you who want to go on and study the UN and think about that as one way to get insights that are super, super useful. Colin Keating continues to be an active, well, he's now a retired ambassador in New Zealand, but very actively interested in questions about the UN. So with that, segue to you. And I will note there have been a number of themes that have come up. Not everyone here is in my class. Some of you may have just signed up to be in my class, but we've already heard themes like rational versus irrational. We were debating today in class, are states rational in the decision to go to war? We've heard about Ralph Bunche, who we talked about at the Howard School, and we've talked a little bit about the role of IOs and liberal international order, also related to our class. But obviously anyone, you don't have to be in my class to ask a question here. Anyone feel free to ask a question and maybe briefly introduce yourself. Who wants to start? And if you're joining us online, very welcome to also ask a question in the Q&A box, and I will respond. Great. Sadie at the back.
Hi, my name is Sadie Hill. I'm a MAIR student, first year. You had said that everything is rational to a certain degree, as long as you act consistently. And I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit more on how that applies to like the UN, because it's such a multifaceted organization that can sometimes have almost internal competing interests.
Thank you for that question. So, right, I mean, when we think of rational actors, we often assume the preferences and then see whether actually they're ranking their preferences consistently over time, right? So that is a very lame, now my pseudo definition of rational. And so instead of assuming preferences, my argument was going towards, well, actually we can examine where preferences are coming from, and then they might still act rationally, even though the impetus into preferences is something that varies for all actors. It's not assumed to be rational that efficiency, which lots of rational choice approaches are fed by, actors want utility maximizing. And utility maximizing is a very material understanding of just getting richer or healthier, but like one thing is like it's this and nothing else. And the moment you actually feed in different goals by different actors, by, for example, what I did, study political parties, you can still be theoretically rational, but have very different goals across the board that are not all shared by actors. So that actually for economists or for anybody who wants to model this is becoming way more complicated to then say where the margin of negotiation and bargaining is. About the UN, though, what that means for the UN, I mean, to me, I would not want to speak about the UN as a homogeneous unitary actor anyway, right? Or of any international organization, the UN being pretty big, especially there. So in that sense, I'm sure there are moments where in hindsight, we can say the UN acted rationally, but that's constructed in my world, in my understanding. So, right. So, I mean, for me, what I would want to look at is, I mean, we have as an analyst abstract at some point something, right? So maybe it is, we'd say like we look at the most powerful actors. So we assume power matters before we then study those actors and see where their preferences come from, and then see whether they were rational and where their preferences come from. Or we say like they're norm entrepreneurs because certain issues are driven not necessarily by material power, but because of the drive and the resources that countries invest in these issues, no matter where the shortcut is, where we just don't look at the full membership of the UN. And depending on the issue, I then would actually look into the preference manifestation over time and how that has been negotiated. I'm not saying that it has to be rational per se, but I would not start at the IO level of analysis. I would go at least one step down.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Michelle. I'm a bachelor and master's student with Hopkins and also first year. And I had two questions specifically assigned for the UN. First, I just wanted to hear your thoughts about the observer status of states in the UN, specifically towards Palestine. What are your pros and cons towards having the status, and should the UN keep this label on certain territories and states? And secondly, do you think that the decline in peacekeeping missions has to do with the legitimacy overall of international organizations within the international community?
So I'm not a UN expert, and so I'm going to try to dodge the first question while also trying to answer it. So to me, I find it interesting that, zooming away from the UN and look at IOs at large, we have many organizations that actually assign or associate states to themselves in different ways, right? As observers, as partners, they're dialogue partners, they're different kind of names as to how states are being associated. And I find at least the way we have conducted research so far is very much just looking into how then interests, conditionality move from the IO to these states, right? Where I would push for more research, also saying like, given that they have associate status, so there's some conversation that they can have with that membership, also how that influences the IO itself. So it's a two-way street. So if we move away from a rights-based understanding of international organizations, so right, you are member, you're not member, right? That's very binary. And instead look into a capacity-based understanding of international organizations. So once you have this kind of access, what kind of capacities are you pursuing? Like, do you give expertise or do you give money earmarked or not to this international organization? What does that mean? Of course, your Palestine question is not really interested in this particular aspect. To that, and this is where I'm still going to dodge, but I'm going to give you a half-minute answer, is that so I find these categories super important. Of course, there also are parking categories. I mean, you can park states in there and say, like, we're not going to figure out your full status for a very long time. Palestine, Taiwan, right? I mean, we have this also, for example, with, I think, the WHO, where it has observer status, but don't quote me on this. Western Sahara as well. But so, I mean, we have certain states that are associated with certain international organizations who want to be recognized as full sovereign states, but that category also keeps them nicely located therein. But to me, this is still the second best solution that I would pursue rather than not having any association, because I think that in the end, that would be the other option. I don't think that if that category wouldn't exist, let's say Palestine would be a full member of the UN or Taiwan of other international organizations, right? So in a way, at least you have a perm rep and you have diplomats that actually can enter the grounds and who can pursue negotiations with other states. Not ideal, but a solution. All right, second question. Apologies. I was dodging very long. The decline of peacekeeping operations. So missions, right, are civilian operations. And so like the UN, the EU, they do the same thing. Missions are civilian and operations are military. So I think we're talking mostly about military operations now. Whether the decline at the UN is also an indication of the decline of the UN's legitimacy at large. Yes and no, because I mean, so to me, that would also, like, who decides on peacekeeping operations is this really small circle within the UN Security Council, right? And they, to a certain degree, are still very interested in what the UN is doing, right? If it would be UNGA votes, and I mean, there is a mechanism, Uniting for Peace, that actually allows UNGA to vote on these operations, but hardly ever used. But if the Security Council and the Security Council members still, I mean, especially the P5, have a certain interest in the legitimacy of the UN, perversely enough, right? But for their own parochial interests most of the time. So in that sense, it's not as much, to me at least, and this is on the top of my head answering your question. Maybe in an hour I will come back to you and I'll be like, no, I'm going to answer the question differently. But it's not as much about legitimacy than about really having these, like, so Russia and China now have not only, they're not anti-order US, they start to develop their own visions of order, right? It's not only against a vision, it's they positively formulating their visions, what I like when China calls developmental peace and what I call for Russia's sphere of influence. And so by having these different visions, there's also much less agreement that can be found in the UN about any kind of peace operation that is going on. So right now, but I mean, for the big operations, we still see the prolongation of some peace operations. So while Russia has invaded Ukraine, Russia also still finds agreement with the US, France, and the UK and the Security Council in prolonging some of the small operations, right? This is all going on in parallel. But yeah, big operations, I have my doubt that they actually come and see eye to eye anytime soon to launch more operations. This is why, I mean, this is something else I've been working on with colleagues at NUPI and at Maastricht, what we call ad hoc coalitions. I mean, what we observe much more now is actually just small coalition of states intervening, say, in the Sahel region, instead of doing a UN peace operation or asking the UN for permission to intervene.
So there's a question online, which I might take because it flows on, and then Daria and Ricardo. So Irakli is asking, are there any viable agendas for UN reform? And does the Russian and possibly Chinese behavior create an impetus for a different institutional design? So building off your point about P5, does the Russian and possibly Chinese behavior at the currently create an impetus for a different institutional design in the UN?
Funnily enough, I don't think so. I mean, especially China, who is really declaring itself the spokesperson for all developing states, right? I mean, it waves that flag wherever it can. Still is not very inclined in giving up its nice position in the Security Council mandate. So I don't see these actors changing or reforming the UN anytime soon. That being said, I don't want to, I mean, I think we can all more or less agree. I mean, we could vote afterwards that the UN Security Council should be reformed and should not consist in the same way of like 5 permanent, 10 elected members who are deciding on the maintenance of peace and security. At the same time, I don't, like you mentioned the Security Council, like you mentioned what the Security Council report did. We also should acknowledge that actually the UN is reforming, even within the Security Council, very, very incrementally. So for example, the E10, when they got elected in on a rotating basis, right, they were just thrown in the Security Council for 2 years, and they're like, here, you figure the stuff out. And they arrived with no historical memory, not knowing what was on the agenda. I mean, especially if you're a smaller state, that's like overwhelming for you to do so, right? And so over time, and these E10 are representing world regions, whatever that means. But so in a way, there is some representation within the UN Security Council. And now actually there are measures being taken that they can join in the discussions a little earlier and listen in. And there are certain files that are being handed to them. So there's some knowledge that travels that also has, at least when you read things like the Security Council report, have improved to a certain degree, at least for these 10 member states who then report back to their regional groupings. Some of what is going on in the UN Security Council. It's not perfect at all, but certain things are being changed in the conduct of everyday work that is also to a certain degree improving how the UN works. But then again, big decisions are hard to come by at any time.
Just a minor note, I think one of the strengths of research like yours of going and interviewing people is understanding what actually goes on a day-to-day basis in IOs, because in some research you get a more sort of overview or a technical aspect of it. But understanding that a small member state, whether it be New Zealand or, I don't know, another country like Thailand, they don't even have a lot of embassies, say in the New Zealand case, in Africa. So if suddenly they're being asked to rule on whether a peacekeeping operation should go forward in Mali or not, and they don't have an embassy, they don't have intelligence, suddenly you're thrown into all of these very intricate discussions which require huge knowledge of a context, of a conflict in a place that's far away. You've never had an embassy there. You have no staff that understand that context. You can see the importance of that information. So again, I think when we study IOs, I think that's one thing I'm interested to pull out in the conversation of how do you actually get to the bottom of like what's going on within those spaces. Daria, oh, you wanted to respond? Yeah.
So, apologies, but if I may, it's another anecdote. But I was an intern at NATO for a while. I also worked for the Germans in the room, they'll know the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, so a political foundation. Germany is a little bit unique in this. All political parties have independent but very closely related to different parties, political foundations. And so this particular foundation has like 96 offices across the world, right? Mini embassies, you can call them too. And given they're close to the Social Democratic Party, they work a lot with trade unions in many parts and also with developing states. And so I was working with them at the UN. And that was during the time of the agenda item financing for development. And so what we did actually for many small embassies were like the embassy staff had 1 or 2 people. We helped write position papers. I mean, now you can think, what does that mean, right? I mean, Germany writing position papers, say for Cambodia. Very problematic. At the same time, Cambodia comes to you and asks for this kind of help because they also want to have speaking minutes. So it's very interesting actually where sometimes these national interests are coming from.
Super interesting. Happens in the climate space too. Yeah. Daria.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Daria. I'm a first year MIA student and I did an internship in Center for Peacekeeping in Berlin before coming here. And my question is, I was wondering whether you see more or less contestation with changes in leadership of countries, whether that translates into international organizations or whether that's mitigated by diplomacy?
Well, it depends a bit on the leadership in the country. I would say that's the lame answer. So when we think of the US, for example, there happened to be a president that maybe helped, well, contestation within a space that we thought was pretty homogenous and not contested, the transatlantic realm, right? So President Trump actually contested a lot of the conventions that exist across the Atlantic. I mean, Antonio can speak much more to this. Sorry, I'm pointing you out, but while I was an intern at NATO, the other guy who was an intern with NATO stayed at NATO. So once in a while, I still talk to him, and just talking to him makes you realize, like, every time Trump came to a summit, right, everybody was nervous. Would he talk on script or off script? And if he talks off script, what will he say? Because most likely he will upset at least one member state, if not the entire NATO membership. So, right, so contestation was very likely, while I mean conversations with other political leaders where you would assume more contestation went maybe more smoothly. So, right, again, like, which diet or which group do we look at where contestation happens? And let's see what the elections will bring. But in that sense, I think that question is really hard to answer in the abstract. It depends on, first of all, whether that country, say, their positions are written by someone else, whether they actually care. So if they care about this issue, right, this issue is salient to them. Not everybody cares about climate change the same way. Not everybody cares about security the same way. But if that issue is salient, and then that political leadership has a different ideological orientation than the previous one, my assumption is that contestation will happen in some area, either on the regional level or the global level.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ricardo, from Bologna University, currently doing a PhD there. I'll be very straightforward because I'm very curious, like, on your opinion. How do you do research about NATO?
And you work on Turkey, right? Yeah.
So, of course, having spent over half a year within the organization is very helpful, because and that was before they had like a fixed internship program and everything. But for my dissertation, that was, I knew who I had to talk to, right? I knew where to find them. I knew the organizational chart inside out. So in that sense, that was very useful. Now, I still know people in the organization. I know by now a few US militaries who are very keen on research too. So, I mean, that's what I find super interesting about NATO. And again, now I feel a little shy saying all of these things in Antonio's presence, because, for example, there you have a former insider. So there's lots of research going on within NATO, and, for example, also within the US military. So this particular friend I have is now a professor at West Point, right, with lots of contacts while he was based in NATO. And in that sense, there's a shared interest in discussing these certain things. Of course, there's always this problem of confidentiality, one of these words I can hardly pronounce. What I learned while working at NATO is that there's always a country who is interested in leaking the information, because everything is considered confidential, but then you read it at the time when I was there in the FT or the Economist the next day or the next week. So then I knew the information, I couldn't make use of it, but I knew where I could find it, and then I could cite it. And right. So, I mean, but you have to have this inside information in a way. I mean, this makes it easy for me. So when I do interviews now and I get answers off the record, I do know that I can find them somewhere and can cite them because they're in some newspaper. So that's how I would approach it, really, like, to go like that. To me, I mean, contemporary NATO stuff beyond the communiques and everything, I would do interviews. I would build a relationship that is trustworthy enough that they know they're not going to get cited, and then look for that information in the broader media sphere. Because, I mean, to my knowledge, at least from what I observed, you'll find it.
So that you can use.
Exactly. So you can actually, exactly.
So you cite the articles, you don't cite the source. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Andrea from the University of Bologna, also doing a PhD, and I study how member states of the Security Council make sure that their preferences are being implemented in UN resolutions, for instance. And I actually have two questions. I don't want to steal too much of your time, but the first one being, from what I got from your talk, but also from interviews I did, what I saw is that international organizations are becoming less efficient in what the general public perceives, but also in terms of what people within it perceive. If we take the United Nations as the example, so there are a number of conflicts today that are ongoing, which UN does not seem to have the tools to manage. And I was asking myself where this comes from, because of course, member states always have a way of putting their national interest to the forefront, but this has always been the case. So the question would be, why does it seem to have increased in the past years, I would say? And is this also a matter of contestation from within the member states? While the second one is more methodological, because you mentioned, for instance, the meeting minutes at the Security Council, and I also rely a lot on that, but I get quite frustrated because what member states told me is that once you make it to this public meeting, everything is on the table, so all cards are on the table. So it's not really that you understand. You may understand what the red line is, but you don't really understand how it came to this red line, who pushed for what. So if you have any guidance or indication or suggestion on that, I would be very happy to hear it. But thank you for the talk.
Thank you very much. I actually very much appreciate when Nina said we're going to do a Q&A. I mean, instead of just a paper presentation, this is also super interesting for me. So thank you very much. So I feel, at least the way I wrote down your first question, this was more than one question. So let's see, but if I don't answer it, please let me know and I'll readdress it. But first of all, whether public opinion, you say, has actually declined in support of IOs per se. I don't know to what public opinion data you refer to, but also we don't have very longitudinal public opinion data on IOs per se, right? So we don't know whether it's ebbing and flowing that much, what the general trend is, whether the question was asked the same way. We talked about lunch quite a bit because, right, I mean, public opinion research is still, it's not new, but I mean, if we compare public opinion research from the 1950s to today, it has changed significantly. I mean, with friends right now, as a little side project, we're looking into, turns out the US, for its time in the 1950s, very sophisticatedly did household surveys in France, Germany, the UK, and also Italy to see whether that's what the supporters of the US, but also what people think about the Soviet Union. These were punch cards, right? So like there was no randomization. You went to houses and who was at home at 5 PM. This is like not random. It was asked and then they put punch cards in and stuff like this. So right, we move from there to today. We know better. We ask questions differently. So in that sense, I'm always hesitant with when we look at public opinion data over a long period of time, what trend we're actually observing. That being said, you also say like, you ask, and that's maybe more of the core of the question than what I just talked about, the US robustness and like the lack of support now, and that we don't manage very well, right? But in a way, I think there also the category of peace operation has changed quite a bit. I mean, for a while, we had very robust operations that were much larger, with much more equipment, which many more people than before and after. Right now, everything goes back to smaller operations. Stabilization becomes the name of the game, and not anymore state building, peace building, which was for a while a mandate of peace operations. And in that sense, I think these bigger operations, by definition, are much harder to support over a long period of time, right? So in that sense, no matter the contestation within the UN, I think the nature of the operation can explain quite a bit already. And then comes also the contestation I talked about a little bit, and the lack of support, it, of course, complicates the things even further. I hope this more or less answers the first question. The second question is like, yes, I mean, so I also did interviews at the UN. I just cut it short like this, right? So in that sense, I completely agree that, and what I discovered, and the ones I like to interview the most in the UN are the legal advisors. They actually are a great resource because they can tell you what member states ask them to clarify or not, and they will tell you the story as to why they don't get asked to clarify. So no, sorry, not member states, but organs in the UN. Organs have to have to ask for clarification. But in a way, for me, they're a great resource, and they are also they seem to care the least about what is confidential and not. So in that sense, but that's always the nature of the profession. So when it's your profession, you are more flexible in using it. So I would always approach legal advisors for certain questions, and then, I mean, go to, like, depending on what you're interested in particular, what you think an honest national actor would be and would tell you a story that maybe no other would tell. Sorry, that's also very abstract, but in a way, I've gone to the African Union representation because I figured they have a very much an interest in this topic. They will be able to speak most. And then what is great about the UN too, I mean, you have this huge biotope of think tanks that are around headquarters, right? So again, depending on the topic, and you have, the United Nations University. And so these are people, or you have, just to call one name, Richard Gowan, who seems to know everything about the UN. And so you have these kind of people who are also very willing to speak and point you to actual decision makers and shapers, well, they're shaping too, that actually can also give you that information that you might then be able to cite via other sources. But I mean, so I think the UN, in a way, I think you can get into this nitty-gritty of, like, before the red lines, what were the contentious issues that we don't see that were already being resolved or just never put on the agenda through these ways.
Just a small point. Thanks for on the issue of public opinion data, there's some work out by Jonas Thalberg and Lisa Delmuth that look at legitimacy of IOs. You're probably familiar with it, but others who aren't, they do look at variation. And actually, he presented this at SICE 2 or 3 years ago, now that I think about it. So it'll be on the BIPR website, and talking about discrepancy or differences between elite and the masses, but also differences in confidence or perceived legitimacy across different UN entities. Because we're here, obviously, we're talking more about the UN and its security apparatus, but there's so many different UN agencies. And I think WHO, this was pre-pandemic, came out, if I recall correctly, quite high in their study as one that publics around the world have high confidence in. I mean, it wasn't a longitudinal study, so it's a snapshot in time study, but it's really interesting for people in the room who are interested to get more into the sort of perceptions. But the one thing that struck me in this study is that people have more confidence in IOs than national government, if I remember it correctly, which is super interesting when you think about it, because we often talk about the crisis of IOs, but actually they were better off, at least in the data they collected. All right, we have time for a couple more questions. So both questions from the Zoom room or from the audience.
I do have a question, although I keep the microphone. We saw, especially the UN, changing throughout time, mostly because of major crises. And I'm referring a lot about the military part, like the intervention, the peacekeeping operation. But despite the changes, we saw, like, the UN seemed to have become more and more bureaucratic, more and more slow in responding to crises. What do you think what was your experience in highlighting what are the major dynamics that push changes within the UN at all levels? Like, are there more bottom up or more top down? And what are these dynamics?
So I mean, I completely agree that bureaucracy has a large role to play in the UN. What is changing there is that less and less people become permanently employed and more people are being temporarily employed, which has a huge impact on the way that policies are being conceived, because you as a UN bureaucrat are much less sure about your next position, basically. I mean, so, which also means there's less expertise, because at least the friends I have, they're running from, they're counterterrorism one day, sanctions the next. And so, like, your portfolio changes quite a bit. While before, would you have had a permanent contract? Well, for promotion, you might move here and there, but not to have the next contract, right? So in that sense, I'm not so sure I would look into the bureaucracy per se, at least for the bottom-up part there, just because it seems to be, from what I understand, much more survival mode now than it used to be before, right? And in that sense, in terms of ideas being pursued, expertise being nurtured and stuff, I would hypothetically speaking, I'm not sure I would look there right away. That of course doesn't speak to the top leader bureaucratic level, but if we really talk about bureaucrats. And then it has slowed down, you said, because as I said, like in 2014, the last peace operations has done. To me, that's very political. That's not bureaucratic, right? So, I mean, the UN in that sense is driven by the political level much more than by the bureaucratic level. I mean, we have certain ideas about peacekeeping that also are nurtured by bureaucracies. I mean, Ralph Bunche basically, like once people had settled that the UN should intervene militarily, say in Egypt or at the border of Israel in Egypt, then he was actually fostering what exactly peacekeeping means. The agenda for peace, R2P, I mean, there are plenty of examples where not only states, but also the UN bureaucracy helped actually define what these constructs are. But to me, the overall development of the UN, the dynamic therein is still, to me, the political, from what I see, is that the political level matters the most.
Go for it. I have a question, but I'll leave it to Ricardo. Yeah.
I feel like my cheeks must be so red.
I was thinking about conflict management, and I was wondering, like, according to you, what is the role of track 2 diplomacy or track 3 diplomacy in conflict management?
Good question. I mean, and I can't answer it, but I can tell you another anecdote if that's okay. In my Swiss life, so before I came to the EUI, I was part of a track 2, track 1.5 dialogue with China on conflict prevention. So a little bit off topic. And so it was to talk to Chinese academics, which more or less by default were also close to government. So already, is that track 2? I don't know. It felt like track 1.5 for sure while talking to them. But in that sense, like it helps you define a little bit more red lines, what doesn't work. Conflict prevention, for example, is a term the Chinese hate because it has the word conflict in there. And that's very problematic to them. And that became very obvious to us in the discussion. And that was something that we then deliberated also when it moved to track 1.5 in New York with some embassies or perm reps. But I'm like, the beauty of it is that if it works, you usually don't know that it has worked. So I have, unfortunately, not a good example where I can tell you this has worked.
Other questions? Had nothing on Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Palestine. I told some people in my class you had to respond to Mearsheimer at a particularly challenging moment. Well, I want to ask a different question then. Sadie has one. I want to ask one question and then go to Sadie. We've talked a bit about the UN and about the challenges doing research and how you get access. What about the African Union? Because you're also interested in that. It's a very different IO.
Yeah, so I've been twice to the African Union, spent 2 weeks there to do interviews, and still haven't written about it because it's a very, like, so as somebody who had studied until then the EU and NATO mainly, right? You have you can call me naive and many other things, but a preconceived notion of how to go about interviewing in international organizations and how to negotiate access to an international organization. Turns out, if you travel, I mean, across the world, and I'm sure the African Union is not particular to this, but like the different ways of getting access to the grounds. And then also there's a different way of thinking through organizational charts, so who is actually responsible for a certain issue domain. And so with the African Union, it turns out my first week I'm not naming the country, but a good friend of mine is a former diplomat of an African state, and he asked the ambassador, and so I had the ambassadorial car, and so things were easy. I went to Addis Ababa, the doors were open. I had the pass. That was great. I could talk to whoever I wanted. The second time I went by myself, none of this worked. And I had to learn how to work around it. So just that already is a very, very different beast. And then, so of course, if you have international organization like the African Union that is more resource dependent, let's say from outside actors than other international organizations, you will actually observe that there are way more actors in that vicinity. I mean, we talked about observer status, right? I mean, the EU is now actually trying to push away again countries who would give associated states because they thought they were too intervening. So in many debates now, they're trying not to invite them anymore, only by case decisions. But in that sense, you already, like, this is where, so when we talked, I have another paper on memberness where actually I was trying to open up this category of resource-based or capacity-based interactions between associate states and international organizations. And the African Union was really what opened our eyes to this, because that also happens in NATO. Actually, NATO opened up to a broad countries of like who are partners, like Bahrain is helping them with certain intelligence gatherings, et cetera, right? So it's not only countries who lack certain resources to address challenges that they define in whose mandate they would like to fulfill, or that, but it can be especially rather resource-weak organizations. And why the slogan is African solutions for African problems, and that the financing should come mainly from African states. To this day, what we observe within the African Union is that countries like China, like the European Union, are heavily engaged in funding this organization. The EU is much easier to trace than China, because China is also just suitcases of cash that are being delivered, and so you don't know how much money that is and whether actually there was any agreement as to for what that money will be spent. But yes, so given that that works very differently to what I had seen through my formal lens, right? I'm still thinking about how to write about the African Union, but it not only makes me think about the African Union, it also makes me think about the European Union and NATO, right? Because once you have observed how IOs work, because it was more evident in a certain case, at least I question myself and go back to the organizations I know better. And it's like, have I just not looked at the right places? Maybe the same thing happens there too. Do I have to look also how certain states, say for the EU, the US, is very much pushing for certain agenda items to come or not come on the EU's agenda, right? And certain kind of funding that is happening there, or certain kind of impositions. And have I thought about the EU as too independent, right? Or like if driven by whatever, the German-French engine or whatever other countries that are pursuing this. So in that sense, it's not only that I've learned plenty about IOs by looking at the IO, but I don't know, I'm still learning a vocabulary to understand the African Union from what I observed empirically, but it also gave me ideas as to think about international organizations I thought I knew well.
Sadie, you had a question.
Hi, I'm back. Within I have an interest in Israeli policy, Israeli history, and things like that. And one thing that I've noticed with this most recent round of escalations with Hamas is that there is like this institutional fear within Israeli society and government of the UN and its ability to resolve conflicts. Is this, and how much do you think it is shaped by the UN's early failures in regards to the conflicts in the Middle East, particularly the 1967 when Egypt kicked the peacekeeping forces out of the Sinai? And that led to the beginning of the Six-Day War.
That's also a question I have not much knowledge about besides reading the news. So that's going to give, I'm just sharing my impression with you. I think it's less about UNEF, that operation that got kicked out, but more about the UN UNGA membership that is pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli, right? So in a way, overall, would a vote be tabled? And I mean, the UN Security Council, I mean, I don't know whether you followed, Guterres just actually used its powers to actually put Gaza on the agenda of the UN Security Council, right? But I mean, there are actors within the UN Security Council who have managed to not talk much about Palestine and Israel, the US, and kept it off the agenda. And then I think, so that's a long-bounded. The moment I'm trying to dodge questions, I talk more about it. But so I think given the actual constellation within the UN, Israel is very wary that if the US wouldn't be in the UN Security Council, and if UNGA would vote, it would be against the Israeli government.
Final questions. Anyone online who wants to ask a final question? Otherwise, from me, is there anything you would want to add to students who are interested in working or studying IOs in future? What are the sort of words of wisdom to students in the classroom who want to go on and maybe work at the UN or NATO?
So, I mean, we talked about interviewing and how to maybe approach the right interview partners and where to think, where to get information from. Also a little bit about different documentary sources, right, that can be very useful, like the Security Council report. You briefly mentioned data sets, and I think if you're interested in IOs, I wouldn't dismiss data sets per se. Like, I mean, Jonas Thalberg and Lisa Delmuth have the legitimacy one, but Jonas also with co-authors has, for example, a data set on openness of IOs, right? So different ways of tackling IOs, at least to get an idea of the overall population of IOs. So like there's one on openness, the way like how many actors have actually kind of associate status to the IO and can join the debates. We have data sets on the authority of international organizations, how much decision-making power is located where, right? So like there are different ways, I think, of trying to understand what the overall trend of international organizations are. You can look at them regionally by policy domain. I think that's a great way of getting an understanding. But yes, other than that, my thing is always think of a super interesting question, right? I mean, the question is just the most important part, and that's only going to be you with your advisor, you with the news or whatever, but like to really figure out, ask a question that it really you can live with for a while and don't have to, I mean, when you write your master thesis or your PhD, like this is something you have to hang out with and be able to hang out with for a while. And the moment you have a good question, you know a lot already because you have read quite a bit already.
And any advice for people who want to work in the organizations?
Good luck.
We'll leave it on that then. Can everyone give a big round of applause? Thanks, Stephanie. I think today's talks covered some really important topics beyond, IR theories. I think some of the reflections I had is also the nature of how these IOs are changing with more outsourcing and consultancy. So many of you may end up in roles where for some period of time, you're also in a consultancy role. So I think theorizing that, but also understanding the reality of that as you go about trying to get internships or jobs is also important because, as you said, it can be very precarious and you're jumping from one job to the next. But more importantly, I think on top of your own individual experience, it's super important thinking and critiquing this idea that the UN from its outset was the heart of the liberal international order and understanding over time how there have always been these ambiguities, always been these tensions within the role. And I know you will have got that from other classes, but I'm really delighted we're able to hear that from you. So thanks so much. And if anyone has any short questions, please feel free to come up and have a quick chat to Stephanie now. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your evening.